Hey everyone, what is going on? This is Curtis Brooks. I am the technical director for Curtis Brooks Media Productions. Today I'm going to talk about one word, actually doing something a little different. And we're going to talk about the word pride. And as business owners, sometimes we have pride. As people in general, pride has a way of taking over sometimes. And I was just compelled today is to come on and talk about pride because it's interesting. Pride sometimes has us fooled. Sometimes we play the fool for pride, and pride sometimes embarrasses us. Pride is interesting because it was just, I don't know, it was just compelled to do this podcast or just come on my screen or my page here and talk about pride and how sometimes pride really makes a mockery out of us. And I think we all have fallen into that category once or twice in a lifetime. And if you haven't, just wait. Just hold on. You'll get there. And pride is, again, very interesting because here, before we get really into this here, hopefully I won't be too long, but I'm just compelled to just talk about this and how pride will really be the destruction of all of us if we allow it to take over, if you will. If we don't acknowledge that it's there, it can in fact come and take over. So I wanted to just talk about that today. First, I want to read you the definition, and this is from dictionary.com, an app that I have on my iPad. So again, that's dictionary.com, and it says, pride, a high or inordinate opinion of one's own dignity, importance, merit, or superiority, whether as cherished in the mind or displayed in bearing, conduct, etc. Definition number 2, a state or feeling of being proud. And number 3, a becoming of dignified sense of what is due to oneself or one's position or character, self-respect, self-esteem. And it's interesting because as I was looking at the word pride, I wanted to know the definition because sometimes we have our own idea of what these words mean, but I needed to hear someone else's thoughts outside of my own as relates to the definition of the word pride. And I also looked at the word dignity, and I ran across this article that talked about dignity versus pride. And the gentleman who was a doctor, he talked about how pride is different from dignity. And I wanted to really refute that because the word dignity is essentially the word dignified. And dignified in itself is much like the word pride. It is a state of mind. And if we take it even further, any word that's spoken or the feeling that comes upon us is in fact a state of mind. And you may be saying, Curtis, how does this relate to brand talk? What are you talking about? Well, this relates to brand talk in a way that many times pride will keep us from doing what we need to do in the way of our business, in the way of serving our customer. Pride will prevent us from stepping out on a limb, if you will, and at sometimes being uncomfortable because pride truly is based in fear. And that is the bottom line. And I challenge you to look into this a bit further and discover where pride comes from. Not so much a biblical term, but the Bible does give a definition of the word pride. And again, I challenge you to look it up. I challenge you to challenge me on this. I'd like to know your thoughts because many of us have the idea that, well, there's nothing wrong with feeling proud. And in fact, there's nothing wrong with feeling that you accomplished something. You know, you had a great day. I've got 9 out of 10 of my chores or tasks completed. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with feeling accomplished and feeling, I guess, somewhat proud. But can pride get in the way? Can we base our pride or that feeling on a former event, if you will? Maybe a situation where we won state champion of something And yet now we're 3 years beyond high school or 3 or 4 years beyond college, and we still have that sense of pride. And here's the interesting thing about pride, because sometimes, because pride is, again, it is motivated by self. Because it is motivated by self, life has a way of subtly changing. And due to pride, we're not able to recognize that it's changed. We're not able to recognize that the very situation that we're in has changed. And again, this absolutely relates to brand talk. Because brand talk, your brand is about your story. Your brand is how people see you, not how you see yourself. Because we all have our own stories, our self-indictment, how we see ourselves, what we think about ourselves. But how does your customer, how do your audience view you? What are they saying about you? Are you willing to go beyond traditional methods of connecting with your customer, your client, your audience? Typically, I would have done a live stream, but I'm kind of torn between, should I do a live stream about this or should I just make it a podcast? But I think I'm just going to make it a podcast and just kind of keep it here. But again, getting back to pride, how pride gets in the way, not just on a personal level, but also on a professional level. Will pride, or does pride, prevent us from connecting with our customer? Does pride make us feel uncomfortable? Does pride prevent us from reaching the next level? Does pride keep us from tapping into that abundance of information that is really available here for all of us? That information that is available, that the universe gives us. Does pride keep us away from that? Do traditions that we have grown up with, that we've shared with our family members and vice versa, do those traditions keep us away from accomplishing what we feel that we need to accomplish? Is pride in the way? And I want you to think about it. I want you to challenge yourself. I want you to ask the question, why? Why am I not here? Are you willing to look beyond the very obstacles? And it's interesting enough because in life sometimes, well before someone tells us about ourselves, or maybe we were rude or we could have handled the situation differently, well before someone tells us about ourselves, or before the messenger or someone sends us a message, we have already received the message. And that often is a lot of times why we just fly off the handle, get upset about certain things, because in most cases, we have already received the message. And life would have it so that someone would come knocking on our door and saying, I have a message for you. You didn't handle that situation in a way that you could have handled it, that it could have been more beneficial to both parties. Maybe you were rude and you, again, could have handled the situation differently. But life does have a way of sending those messengers, those strangers sometimes, and we wonder why, or we may say to ourselves, wow, that was interesting, that was strange. No, it wasn't strange, because the universe always has a message. And the only way that we can tap into that message, we have to remove the obstacles that prevent us from being fruitful in what the universe has to share with us. So it is true that pride can really be a stumbling block. Pride can be sometimes beneficial. At least that's what we believe that it is. We believe that it's beneficial. But pride can actually be a hindrance, a stumbling block. So how do we prevent pride from being the stumbling block? I'd like to say that life is give and take constantly. You have to give it, you receive it, you give it, you receive it. It's back and forth. It's always an exchange, always. Even when you meet a person, make connections, there's always an exchange of energy. And it's such as life. When we receive those attaboys, those applauds, those great job, pats on the back for different things that we've accomplished, or we begin to pat our own selves on the back for our accomplishments. No sooner than we've received those things, we must desire to let them go. Because if not, if we don't let them go, we can be stuck in a moment of pride, holding onto a moment that is already past. And yet we find ourselves gloating in a moment that we may believe or that we think is still present. And yet life has moved on, maybe perhaps 5-6 years from now. And we're still gloating over that state championship that we won, college perhaps, the 4.0 grade average that we received. So pride, in fact, can be in the way. And what about this thing, dignity? And that was my issue with the article, because the doctor, and I believe he was a doctor of psychology, he said that instead of having pride, let's have dignity. And my challenge with that was that dignity sometimes, or a lot of times I believe, it's just really a play on words. It's essentially a person who has perhaps had challenges or some kind of addiction, and addiction comes in many different forms and different sizes, if you will, but a person who has a challenge with one thing but yet picks up another. A person who goes from having a weight issue, now they're having a drinking issue. And essentially it's exchanging one thing for the other. And that's why I said moments ago, it's so important that we let it go. And I know it's hard because I've had my own challenges. We want to hold on to those former wins, if you will. Oh, I was great back in high school. I was great back in college. And yet, now in this huge world that we live in, no one knows us. We're in a different space, different place. No one remembers our win. No one remembers the accomplishments. But we find ourselves hanging on, self-indictment, boosting our own selves up. And as I mentioned moments ago, many times we find ourselves really hanging on to fear and trying to be, or at least trying to look different in the eyes of those who may be successful. Pride is fear. Pride is sometimes the shame that we are holding on to. Maybe because we don't feel accomplished. Maybe because various other reasons. Our household, things that we grew up with or their lack of. And we find ourselves trying to boost our own selves up, encourage our own self. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with encouraging our own selves. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with that. But to the point where when pride comes in, it actually is really standing above someone else. And in most cases, it's out of what we don't have to make ourselves look bigger in the eyes of those who we believe or deem that they do have. And in most cases, we don't know their situation. We really don't know anyone's situation unless they divulge that information to us. But even as the individual divulges the information or shares the information with us, can we count that the information is true? Well, do people share their information in pride? Pride makes us look bigger than we are because we don't want to feel vulnerable. It's always a challenge sometimes when you're sometimes next to people, perhaps when you're driving and you're in your car, perhaps it's an older vehicle, and you look to your left or your right and you see this nice looking car. It's sitting there, it's looking good, and the person driving the car is looking nice. And all these different thoughts come to mind. And perhaps your situation is different, but my point is that when we are in a place where we are standing next to someone who, in our mind, that appears that they are accomplished, we can find ourselves ready to create stories, ready to share something, even if it's not asked of us. We are maybe giving too much information to make ourselves look bigger because of what we think about ourselves. And pride essentially and eventually gets in the way of us doing business. As much as we want to believe sometimes in life that there's our personal space and there's our professional life, the opposite. It's not true. There's one life that we live. It's one huge circle, if you will. And the personal life matters, the matters that affect us in our personal lives, many times those matters spill over into our professional lives. So in essence, there's really no separation. Because if we decide to separate it, it's really essentially not any different from pride versus dignity. And dignity is essentially the word dignified. And I would often hear times when I was in church from my nieces and other church members that I was dignified. And at the time I hadn't looked the word up, but now I'm not sure if it was a good thing. But at the time I accepted it and just moved on. So it is for us to remember that pride can, in fact, get in the way of business, get in the way of us creating opportunities, or at least reaching those opportunities because of pride. Because we're afraid. And really, pride prevents us from seeing the other person. That other person could be your customer, your spouse, your significant other, your children, family member. It prevents us from seeing and also hearing, and logically, it prevents us from understanding the other side. Because pride can be so rooted deeply in each of us. Because in our mind, we have a story to tell. Pride is essentially me, me, me. Let me go first. And it sounds like, well, that's being assertive. That's being aggressive. Pride can be a lot of different things. Pride essentially is overcompensating. And many times we overcompensate because of what? Fear. Pride is rooted in fear. Pride becomes really about us. It's about what we think about ourselves. Not so much about what others think about us. Because in most cases, pride locks out anything that could challenge itself, challenge the very thought that we are thinking about ourselves. Pride keeps it on the other side of the door and says, you will not come in here and disrupt my view of how I see myself. And as I wrap it up here, pride is essentially the obstacle that prevents us from stepping into our greatness. So I invite you to challenge yourself. I invite you to look in those different areas of your life and ask yourself the question, am I being prideful? Do I have a story to tell when really no one asked about your story? Do I have a story to tell when I'm feeling uncomfortable about someone else's story or their accomplishments? Do I feel that I need to tell my story or share my story when others are sharing their stories? Sometimes pride, or a lot of times pride, gets in the way and prevents us from being great in the eyes of others versus our own isolated opinion or thought about ourselves. So, guys, this has been absolutely awesome, and I thank you for chiming in. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Jasmine. And I'm sorry I didn't acknowledge you until now. I apologize about that. But I was just on a roll. I just wanted to talk about this because it was just pressing on my heart this morning, and just wanted to share. So I apologize for not acknowledging you or anyone else that's in the podcast or the broadcast. Again, thank you everyone for listening. And again, just think about pride. How is pride disrupting your business? Not only personal. Remember, guys, it's one big circle. We sometimes have a tendency to think that, well, I'm going to separate things and put them in different boxes. But in fact, there's no such thing. Because we can, in fact, lose the connection when we're in need of being, when it's important to be connected, even in a professional environment, I should say. We can have that tendency to disconnect personally, when in fact that we need to connect on a personal level, even in a professional environment. So it is important to know that this is one big circle, or small circle, or medium-sized circle. Know that it's possible to allow pride. It's possible to allow pride to really disrupt things and get in the way and just make a fool or make a mockery out of us, as I mentioned earlier. And we think that we are doing something great, when in fact, your customer, they've been waiting for you to come down so that you and I can make the connection with them and be the answer for the very questions that they've been asking. So think about it. All right, guys, I am going to say ciao for now. See you later.